Around the world, deserts are expanding faster than nations can respond. And China was teetering on the brink of collapse as dunes advanced toward entire communities. Then, without warning, a school teacher launched a plan so bizarre it defied logic, covering the desert with hundreds of millions of willow trees, releasing millions of rabbits, and forming solar panels on a colossal horse. The transformation astonished global experts, but the truth behind how it happened is far more unsettling than anyone expected. Let's begin with the moment everything started to go wrong. The desert began to act as if it were alive. Farmers in northern China awoke to find their homes buried under sand dunes that hadn't existed in the days before. By the time officials realized what was happening, entire villages were already disappearing beneath waves of desert that advanced like a living predator, consuming fields, roads, and farmland with terrifying speed. The Kabuki Desert was at the heart of the crisis. More than 18,600 square kilometers of barren sand, where temperatures plummeted to minus 20 degrees Celsius in winter and cracked the ground in the summer heat. Yet it wasn't the weather that terrified the locals. It was the relentless advance of the sand. People would wake up to find dunes taller than their homes, replacing fields they had planted just days before. By the early 2000s, the Kabuki had advanced more than 40 kilometers east, swallowing thousands of acres each year. Desertification was no longer a local problem. Nearly 4% of China's land, an area 4 times the size of Texas, had already been overtaken. But there's more. 20 million tons of crops are lost annually. Sandstorms reached cities like Beijing, turning day into night hundreds of kilometers away. The government tried everything. In the 1950s and 1960s, officials planted windbreak forests, restricted grazing, and drilled deep wells to anchor the soil. Billions were spent. Tens of thousands of workers toiled in scorching heat and bone-chilling cold. Still, the sand didn't stop. It simply changed course and kept moving forward. More than 400 million people lived along its edges, never knowing if their homes would survive the next season. Most experts believed the desert was unstoppable. Between 1950 and 2000, China spent more than $30 billion planting windbreak forests. Yet satellite data showed that the Kabuki Desert expanded by 4,040 square kilometers during that same period. The trees died because the soil itself was dead. Entire communities were prepared to abandon their lands. But as the country watched the land slowly disappear, one man refused to accept that nothing could be done. He wasn't a scientist, a government worker, or even wealthy. He was just a school teacher who lived close enough to the dunes to watch them erase everything familiar. And instead of giving up, he chose to confront the desert head-on, setting in motion an outcome no one expected. And when he finally revealed his solution, it was so absurd that even his closest followers assumed he'd lost his mind. Because nothing about releasing 1 million rabbits into the most inhospitable desert in the world made any logical sense. The man who tried to stop the desert. Wang Wenbiao, a school teacher, drained his entire life savings. He borrowed millions of yuan, using his salt factory as collateral, accumulating debts that would take his family 15 years to repay, and moved his family into a shack surrounded by sand dunes that threatened to bury them alive, all to pursue an idea so reckless that everyone assumed he'd lost his mind. While the desert continued to devour the land like an unstoppable machine, he believed he had found a way to halt it, and the risk he took would become the turning point no one saw coming. To him, this wasn't just the weather. It was a warning of how fast the desert was closing in. One morning, after yet another struggle just to get to his classroom, he realized he couldn't keep running from the shifting dunes. If the desert didn't stop advancing, then it would confront him himself. It sounded impossible. His friends laughed. Officials dismissed his idea outright, but he refused to back down. Wang had watched the desert consume 3 neighboring villages in just 5 years. In 1988, a severe sandstorm buried the main road for 8 days, cutting off the food and medicine supplies. That's when he decided waiting for government solutions was no longer an option. He had a small salt factory that barely supported his family. Nevertheless, he spent every penny, borrowed beyond his means, and bought large tracts of land that no one wanted because they were nothing but sand. Then he moved with his family right into the Kabuki Desert, living in a small cabin surrounded by dunes that threatened to bury the walls on stormy nights. People assumed it was only a matter of time before his debts crushed him, but instead of slowing down, he accelerated. Nero began investing in equipment and supplies far beyond what a small factory owner should have been able to afford. Bulldozers, millions of willow saplings, thatch for barriers, miles of drip irrigation lines, and enough fencing to delineate entire sections of empty land. He was preparing for a fight that, from the outside, seemed impossible to win. While everyone expected him to fail, Wang worked as if he knew something no one else did. And when the first phase of his plan finally took shape, it surprised even his biggest doubters. Because his next move was so audacious, it would change the entire course of the Desert War. The creatures no one expected. Before the world knew why the dead desert of northern China had suddenly stopped expanding, researchers traced the turning point back to something that seemed impossible. After stabilizing the dunes, Wang introduced rabbits that appeared harmless, but would become the most disruptive element of the entire transformation. At first glance, no one understood why these animals mattered, but the impact they created would astonish scientists worldwide years later. With the willows holding the sand in place and the soil no longer shifting with every storm, Wang knew the land needed more than shade to recover. He needed something that could survive harsh weather conditions, multiply quickly, and generate the one ingredient that was missing more than anything else in the Kabuki Desert: soil that could sustain life. Wang needed animals that could produce nitrogen-rich waste, survive winters of minus 20 degrees Celsius, not overgraze the young willows, and could be contained in simple cages. Sheep produced more manure, but they would destroy the windbreaks. Goats were too destructive. Chickens couldn't survive the cold. Only Rex rabbits met all the requirements. These weren't wild rabbits scavenging for scraps, but a carefully selected breed known for its high-value, soft fur that sold for premium prices. They required little water, tolerated freezing nights and extreme heat during the day, and reproduced at a much faster rate than common rabbits. Each female produces between 6 and 8 litters per year, with 8 to 12 kits per litter, resulting in 50 to 70 kits per doe under optimal conditions. With proper breeding management, populations could double every 6 months. Every rabbit remained in clean, enclosed farms. None were released into the wild. Every part of the operation generated income, making the entire system financially self-sustaining. But the real breakthrough came from something most people never considered: waste. Desert sand contained no nutrients, no nitrogen, no phosphorus, no potassium, nothing plants needed. Rex rabbits produce tiny, concentrated pellets that act as ready-to-use fertilizer. Because rabbits couldn't fully break down the seeds, each pellet contained both nutrients and raw plant seeds, making each dropping a compact starter kit for new vegetation. When the pellets fell onto the sand and mixed with the next rain, grasses and shrubs sprouted with their own natural supply of nutrients attached. Over a few years, areas treated in this way produced several tons of dark, fertile soil per hectare. Regions once dismissed as barren began to show signs of recovery that experts had deemed impossible. Wang didn't just introduce rabbits. He activated a biological engine that rebuilt the earth from the ground up. And once this cycle began to repeat itself, the advance of the desert slowed down and then stopped, setting the stage for an even stranger outcome that no one had predicted. The cycle no one thought could exist. By 2005, satellite analysis detected a 1.2% increase in organic matter across 550 square kilometers in just 18 months. For comparison, the natural formation of desert soil takes 500,000 years to achieve the same increase. Scientists couldn't explain what was accelerating the process. When researchers traced the transformation back to its origin, they discovered a biological cycle so precise it seemed engineered, except no one had engineered it that way. Willow trees had grown tall enough to block sunlight and reduce surface heat, stabilizing the soil beneath. Their tender shoots provided a reliable food source for rabbits, which thrived in conditions that killed most other animals. As the rabbits ate, their nutrient-rich pellets fell onto the sand, providing the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium the desert desperately needed, along with undigested seeds ready to sprout. Rabbits' digestive systems operate at 38 to 39 degrees Celsius, hot enough to kill pathogens but cool enough to preserve hard seed coats. Seeds of hardy desert plants pass through intact, pre-soaked, and coated with nitrogen fertilizer, creating natural germination pellets. When rain or irrigation hits the pellets, the top layer of sand begins to darken and become fertile. Over the course of a year, each hectare produced approximately 5 tons of new humus. The richer soil made the willows grow faster, producing more shoots, casting more shade, and retaining moisture better. Each improvement in one part of the system amplified the others. Healthier trees fed more rabbits enriched the soil, and better soil fed the trees even faster. To anchor the dunes long enough for the cycle to be firm, workers laid down grids of straw and installed a drip irrigation system to support the seedlings until their roots reached the groundwater. Combined with over 200 million willow trees planted as windbreaks, drip irrigated to sustain the saplings until their roots reached the water table, the wind speed was drastically reduced, giving the land room to recover. Within 3 to 5 years, hundreds of square kilometers had been transformed from dead sand into fertile soil. Decades later, millions of hectares were home to thriving willow forests, farms, biogas systems fueled by rabbit manure, and greenhouses producing crops where nothing had previously survived. The same desert that once buried entire villages now blocks vast amounts of dust from reaching major cities. And when Wang looked at kilometers of stabilized land under the relentless sun, he saw something no one had yet considered: potential far beyond trees and rabbits. The machine that changed the desert, again. By 2015, rabbit fur sales were generating steady income, but expanding the restoration to millions of additional acres required infrastructure investments beyond what livestock alone could finance. Wang recognized that the stabilized desert had an abundant untapped resource: year-round sunlight, averaging 3,200 hours annually. Just when everyone thought Wang's desert reclamation had reached its limit, something massive appeared that defied logic. A geometric pattern so large it could be seen from space, constructed from 196,000 solar panels arranged in the shape of a galloping horse. The horse design wasn't decorative. It's the cultural symbol of Inner Mongolia, making the installation instantly recognizable in satellite imagery. This attracted international media coverage and tourism that standard rectangular arrays never generate, turning infrastructure into marketing. This wasn't just a record-breaking energy installation. It was a new layer of ecological engineering that no one had anticipated. With willows growing, the soil recovering, and rabbits driving self-sustaining cycles, Wang recognized that the desert had one resource in abundance: sunlight. Instead of a standard solar farm, he designed a structure that generated 1.5 billion kilowatt hours of electricity annually, enough to power approximately 400,000 Chinese homes, averaging 3,000 to 4,000 kilowatt hours per year, compared to, in more than 10,000 hectares in the US, solar power is used to save 760,000 tons of coal and remove 1,850,000 tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere each year. At China's solar-powered rates, this generates approximately $150.2 billion annually in revenue, funding the expansion across thousands of additional hectares. Revenue from energy sales bolstered all other parts of the restoration effort, but the real breakthrough occurred beneath the panels. Mounted 244 meters above the ground, they cast a continuous shade, lowering surface temperatures, slowing evaporation, and reducing wind speed by up to 50%. The cooler, calmer microclimate allowed ramine grasses to sprout in areas that had been barren for decades. The soil recovered faster, and the cycle of life, trees, rabbits, and fertilizer, expanded under the protective canopy. Farmers introduced grazing animals, sheep, geese, and the same rabbits that had fueled the previous soil restoration, and the fertilizer spread beneath the protective canopy. The animals grazed the grass, fertilized the soil, and reinforced the cycle. In just 4 years, 1,052 hectares around the solar horse were transformed from barren gold to vibrant green. The site quickly attracted attention. Dead land had been transformed into a functioning power plant, a grazing pasture, and a tourist attraction all at once. Visitors marveled at the enormous solar horse and the thriving ecosystem beneath it, witnessing a desert rebirth unlike anything they had ever seen. But even with all this momentum building and infrastructure expanding across the desert, the next phase of Kabuki's transformation didn't come from Wang's planning or engineering. It came from something the team hadn't anticipated, something that would prove the biological systems they had activated were far more powerful than anyone understood, setting the stage for an economic explosion that would change thousands of lives within a decade. An economic boom for the locals. In less than 5 years after the first rabbits began to reproduce, families surviving on less than $1 a day started earning 5-figure incomes from an industry that didn't exist before Wang arrived. Wealth flowed so quickly that migrant workers began leaving city jobs to raise rabbits in the middle of a desert most still considered worthless. Desolate Banner became the center of this. Wang's company, the Lion Resources Group, established training centers where experienced farmers taught rabbit breeding. The company provided the initial breeding stock on credit, deducting the costs from future fur sales. This removed the capital barrier for families without savings. By 2017, the region had 4.5 million Rex rabbits in modern sheds, producing over 3 million pelts and carcasses each year. That alone generated around $76 million directly for local families. These were the same people who had previously struggled to keep scrawny goats alive in the sand and were suddenly running profitable livestock businesses. The system was simple. A family invested around $2,700 to $4,100 in cages and a few hundred breeding rabbits. In their first year, they were already earning between $6,800 and $13,600. Larger setups earned 6-figure incomes. More than 10,000 households rose from extreme poverty to a stable middle-class life in just a few years. As the money flowed, the landscape changed again. In 2013, the government and Wang's company invested more than $400 million in new towns, roads, clinics, schools, and housing blocks, right on land that had previously been useless. That construction created new jobs, but the rabbit economy created even more. People worked on rabbit farms, at biogas facilities fueled by rabbit waste, cleaning solar panels, and at tourist centers built around the enormous horse-shaped power plant. It didn't stop there. Migrant workers began moving to the desert because wages were higher there than in many cities. Elderly herders who had never been to school were buying new pickup trucks. Parents were sending their children to college on rabbit income. The change was so dramatic that locals joked the desert had finally stopped fighting them. But as the celebration grew and tourists lined up to take selfies with baby rabbits, a different feeling began to spread among scientists and environmental groups. Something about this economic boom didn't seem right. The success felt too perfect, too fast, and too dependent on a single species. So, a group of scientists was asking questions no one wanted to hear. Because if this same animal had destroyed an entire continent, what made China think they had it under control? Nature's stunning return. Something strange began to happen at Kabuki just when everyone thought the rabbit project had peaked. It wasn't another machine, another solar trick, or another human scheme. It was something no one ordered, designed, or predicted, and it began to appear in the most unexpected ways. Rangers started filing reports that made no sense. Animal tracks of species that had been extinct in the region for decades, plant varieties that no one had planted suddenly appearing in formations across the sand, and groundwater measurements that violated everything scientists thought they knew about how deserts die. Because Kabuki's water table was rising, not falling, and no one could explain why. Sightings began to accumulate rapidly. Wild deer that were thought to be gone forever were suddenly moving in herds through restored sections. Desert foxes were reappearing around vegetation as if the previous 30 years had never happened. Even migratory birds that used to avoid Kabuki altogether now land there in large numbers during seasonal migrations. According to China's Ministry of Ecology, populations of key species had quadrupled since the 1990s, all without direct human intervention. That was just the beginning. Botanists began finding native plants that no one had planted. Feathergrass, hardy poplar, and dozens of small desert grasses peeked through the sand among the saplings. Places that old satellite photos showed as barren desert were now forming early-stage forests. The desert wasn't just stabilizing, it was transforming into a functioning ecosystem. Then came the discovery everyone thought impossible. Groundwater had returned. Measurements showed that the water table rose between 1.5 and 2 meters across multiple regions in 20 years. Wells that previously required deep drilling now reach water halfway down. For a desert that had been drying up for generations, this changed everything. With the rise in groundwater, plants could survive without constant human support, and wildlife naturally followed. The forests of Inner Mongolia expanded to 23,877,539 hectares, the largest forested area in the country. Grasslands again reached 45% coverage, the highest level since 1990. Even Beijing's dust storms, once a seasonal nightmare, diminished dramatically because the new vegetation was trapping the dust before it left the desert. More than 100 native plant species returned, creating scenes few would have thought possible. Golden sand mingled with green grass and small patches of forest glistening in the sunlight. The soil here was no longer blown around by the wind. Instead, it was loose and carried the earthy scent of life, returning after decades of absence. For the first time in living memory, Kabuki was no longer expanding outward, it was shrinking. Nature had taken the foundation humans had built and accelerated it far beyond anyone's expectations. The biological systems Wang activated had become self-sustaining, improving faster than scientists could keep up. The United Nations quickly took notice. In 2011, Kabuki was recognized as a global model for land restoration. By 2019, it officially became an international demonstration site, an honor few places worldwide receive, validating this as proven science rather than an isolated experiment. But before anyone could celebrate the rabbit miracle as humanity's solution to desertification, scientists discovered a terrifying pattern in the historical data, raising questions that threatened everything. Controversies and the rabbit paradox. Before anyone could celebrate the rabbit miracle, scientists discovered a terrifying pattern in the historical data. The same animal that was saving China's desert had already destroyed 2/3 of Australia's grasslands, turning them into dust basins that have yet to recover. And that's when the uncomfortable questions began. Australia's experience is the nightmare version. In 1859, 24 rabbits were released for sport. 50 years later, the population had exploded to over 1 billion. They stripped the vegetation bare, uprooted plants, and turned massive regions into dust basins. Fences, poisons, viruses, dynamite, even helicopter hunts. Nothing stopped them. Australia lost control almost immediately. So, if rabbits can destroy an entire continent, why didn't they destroy Kabuki? The answer is surprisingly simple. China never gave them the chance. Every Rex rabbit is kept in controlled cages, fed measured amounts of willow shoots, and harvested on a set schedule. No roaming, no overgrazing, no unexpected breeding explosions. At Kabuki, the rabbits act more like biological machines than wild animals. That's where the controversy begins. Critics argue that the rabbits aren't the miracle, they're just the pet. Behind the scenes, billions of yuan were invested in irrigation systems, thatched grids, new roads, and high-tech farms. Some environmental economists estimate that infrastructure accounts for 85 to 90% of the investment. Irrigation systems, thatch grading, road construction, and initial tree planting are all part of the process, with rabbit operations accounting for only 10 to 15% of the total costs. They point to other deserts showing recovery using only trees and irrigation, suggesting that rabbits are optional. Wang's team argues that previous efforts spent billions on infrastructure before 2000 and failed because the dead soil couldn't support vegetation. Rabbits alone cannot provide the biological activation infrastructure. According to these experts, the real transformation came from engineering and money, not rabbit droppings. But another concern runs deeper. Rabbit manure is a powerful fertilizer, but too much can overload the soil. Some test areas are already showing nitrogen spikes, pH changes, and even algal blooms in the runoff water. The system works, but only if the population is kept under control. If expansion outpaces monitoring, the rabbits could end up damaging the very land they helped revive. The model also faces sustainability questions. What happens if fur prices plummet and the economic incentive disappears? What if disease forces mass culling? What if political priorities shift and funding is cut? The entire ecosystem now depends on ongoing human management, industrial-scale harvesting, and economic structures that keep rabbit populations stable. Remove any of those supports and the biological balance could collapse faster than it was built. Despite these concerns, global recognition continued to flow. Spain, the driest country in Europe, began copying the strategy almost verbatim, and that's when everyone realized it wasn't just about China anymore. The question wasn't whether the method worked, but whether it could work everywhere, and what would happen if it didn't. This is the question that keeps environmentalists up at night. Did Wang Wenbiao discover a revolutionary way to reverse desertification that will save dying landscapes around the world? Or did he simply find a cost-effective method to delay a disaster that future generations will have to clean up after the systems being built today inevitably fail? A teacher, over 1 million rabbits, and a gamble that turned out beyond anyone's expectations. Or at least it has so far. But whether this is the solution that saves the world's dying deserts, or the beginning of a problem we won't fully understand until it's too late, might hinge on a question no one can answer yet. What happens the day we lose control? What do you think? Is kabuki the model for saving Earth's deserts? Or are we creating millions of mini Australias that haven't yet exploded? Leave your answer in the comments section, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that seem impossible until you see the evidence. Thanks for watching. See you next time.